The summer before heading off to college, my friend Camden and I were celebrating our last summer together. We'd grown up together as neighbors, but we were heading off to different colleges. Our plans were about as simple as they can get. There was a blank space in our calendars, a decent sum in our bank accounts, and a gassed-up car. That's it. That first week was insane. Camden had to balance constant calls from his mom with being an absolute beast. He'd be doing cranberry vodka shots one second and calmly describe his breakfast in perfect detail the next. We spent 2 days with his distant relatives in Rochester. He may or may have not made out with one of his own cousins during a particularly high-stakes truth or dare. I can neither confirm or deny. A couple of days before heading home, we decided to have a final camping night. We split up for a day to see our families and get some supplies together, then meet up at Lake Attabat. Lake Attabat was a bit of a local secret. We got to know about it from Camden's cousins, who more or less dared us to go there. I mean, they expressly told us not to go there, but we took it as a challenge. It was supposed to be an old fishing lake surrounded by small cabins for rent, but the owners had neglected them for decades. All that was left were these crumbling log cabins and an absolutely stunning beach. I was looking forward to getting some alone time with Camden. We'd been so busy living the high life that we hadn't gotten any time to just chill, to talk about the future and make plans, maybe go fishing. But when I rolled up to Lake Attabat, Camden was already there, and he wasn't alone. He brought 4 friends to keep the party going. The only one I knew by name was Harris. He'd been an acquaintance hanging at the edge of our social circle for a while, a weird guy who asked a lot of questions. But I also knew that the only reason Camden would invite him would be to get a shot at his older sister. We'd never been formally introduced, but her name was Tammy. She didn't look the part of your average law student. She looked so much more at home in a mosh pit in a sweaty basement. Tammy had, in turn, brought 2 of her sorority friends. The 3 of them were in the process of claiming the least rotten cabin off the beach, as Camden and Harris collected firewood. Camden waved me over, calling out everyone to come meet me. My heart sank a little. It was gonna be fun, but I would have liked to just spend some time with my friend. This was quickly turning into something different. I was surrounded by smiles as I was introduced to Tammy, Pam, and Carrie. Harris gave me an uncertain wave from the sidelines. Camden wrapped an arm around my neck. "This is my brother right here," he called out. "I'm the pretty one, he's the good one." And just like that, the stage was set. We ended up making a fire by the beach, grilling a few hot dogs and having a couple of beers. Harris wasn't really feeling it, and ended up spending most of his time fixing the old floating dock instead. I noticed Carrie was giving me a little extra attention. She was a peculiar woman, with a long face and almost cartoonishly large eyes, but her confidence and genuine personality was difficult not to like. I ended up talking to her for well over an hour. Harris came back with his hands on his hips, clearing his throat to get some attention. "I need something to tie the tanks with," he said. "The what?" Camden asked. "What are you talking about?" "The barrels, the things that make the dock float." Harris sighed. "I need something to tie them on." "Just ditch it." Camden frowned. "Come on, sit down, have a snack." "Didn't you say we were gonna fix this thing?" Harris snapped back. "Or was that just something you said to keep me busy?" It got awfully quiet. I looked around and pointed to one of the old cabins. "I think I saw a garden hose out back," I said. "You can use that. It won't rot." Harris gave his sister, and Camden, a long look. He shook his head, thanking me under his breath. To Harris's credit, he did manage to fix that floating dock. It was big enough for all 6 of us, as long as we stood up. If someone was gonna sunbathe on it, we might fit 3 if we crowded a bit. The thing was surprisingly solid. Harris definitely knew a couple of sailor's knots to keep the supports in place. Harris and his sister were polar opposites. While Harris kept to himself, Tammy was taking bikini selfies next to the no diving sign. Pam was off talking to her parents on the phone, while Carrie and I were sitting beachside, dipping our feet in the warm water. The sun was setting in about an hour or so, covering the lake in a golden glow. This was going to be a great night. I could tell. We all went out on the floating dock, Tammy and Camden sitting side by side at the edge, kicking us out into the lake. We were cheering, teasing, laughing, all the things you're supposed to do when you're young and curious. We went out to the middle of the lake. Everyone but Harris dove in head first, ignoring the abandoned no diving sign. The lake was colder than expected, and I wasn't the only one to shiver a little. That didn't stop us though. Within seconds, I saw a bikini top being tossed around like a ball, and there were smiles every which way I turned. Well, except for Harris. He turned to us, saying something. I'm not sure what. He was pointing, trying to get our attention, but that wasn't happening anytime soon. I had Carrie right next to my ear, asking me to keep her warm. Camden and Tammy were just full on making out against the floating dock. I casually looked the way Harris pointed. I could see something in the distance. There was someone on the beach. I didn't know what to make of it, even at a distance. I could tell they were tall, somewhere around 6'8", possibly a man. He was wearing some kind of World War II era rubber mask, but without a filter. He had this massive gray trench coat that looked too big even on him. It left a long trail in the sand. There were countless pockets sewn on the outside. He had a crossbow. Not one of those black, sleek modern ones, but something he'd put together in a garage somewhere. The thing was massive, probably made from the leaf spring of an old car. It was solid metal. The second we looked his way, he hooked the crossbow to something on his belt and stepped into the sand. Despite such a massive frame, I could tell he was struggling. There was a loud click. He pulled something out of his coat, an arm's length of sharpened rebar. It just took a couple of seconds, all in all, and the sight was too strange to react appropriately. Harris looked back at the rest of us as the conversation died down. We were still smiling, but it wasn't a conscious reaction. It felt like rabbits freezing at the sight of a predator, hoping it wouldn't see it. But of course it did. We were completely exposed on the open water. Harris turned to his sister, casually pointing towards the beach. You know that guy? Tammy clung to Camden's shoulder, looking towards the beach. I saw her eyes go wide as the man on the beach raised the crossbow. He didn't need time to aim. We were sitting ducks. There was a click, a thunk, and a whip-like snap. It was less than a second. A bolt of sharpened rebar, as long as my arm, burrowed deep into Harris's chest. There was no scream or cry, just a puff of air as his lungs emptied. I still hear that sound sometimes. A single forceful cough, like he swallowed something the wrong way. The force was so intense that it looked like turning off a switch. Harris smacked down into the floating dock with complete abandon, splaying his arms out like a crucifixion. Immediate panic erupted. Camden held Tammy back from climbing on the floating dock. Carrie and Pam hid under it. I didn't understand what was happening and lingered a little too long, watching our attacker hook the crossbow on his belt and step down, preparing for a second shot. Had it not been for Camden calling my name, I wouldn't have snapped out of it. I dove, swam over to the others, and hid under the floating dock. There was already blood dripping between the planks. Tammy couldn't stop screaming, her eyes so wide they looked black. The shouting was so loud and constant that it just blended into a mix, making it sound like nothing at all. This was just what the world was like now. Panicked open mouths, screaming at everyone for answers. There was an awful cracking sound as 4 planks were torn apart by a second shot. The force rippled through the air, and I could feel it even at a distance. We hid under the dock, keeping our heads down and trying to show as little of ourselves as possible. But seconds later, I heard him firing again. Another couple planks exploded into tattered fibers, the hole funneling Harris's blood right down on us, mixing the smell of wet wood with sickening volumes of blood. Everyone was talking and screaming over one another. Carrie was screaming at us to dive, while Pam was telling us to split up. We didn't do either. Instead, I watched through the gaps in the dock how the man reloaded again and got down on his knees. He was planning something. He was shooting at an angle, trying to get the bolt to skip across the surface. It worked. There was this approaching noise heading straight for us. I could see the ripples on the lake where the bolt had touched down. It was dark under the dock, but I could hear the shot slamming into the back of Pam's cranium. The water got warm as life left her. Tammy tried to get away, but Camden was holding her back. If she swam out from under the dock, she'd be an easy target. Instead, we hid behind the supports, these large white air tanks made of hardened plastic, with little blue sunflower logos on the side. Another shot rippled across the water. It smashed through the dock, effectively ripping it in half as the last plank shattered. Some of the supports came loose, but me and Carrie clung to them like life vests. "They're not hard enough," Camden screamed, holding Tammy close. "We gotta do something." "What?" Carrie screamed back. "What the fuck are we supposed to do?" Another shot. This one crashed into the side of the support I was holding onto, ripping it out of my arms. It snapped my shoulder so bad that I got a bruise. It was such massive force, like a battering ram. I was fine, but left exposed. I got a clear view of him hooking the crossbow to his belt again and stepping down on the crossbow, already preparing another bolt from his jacket. I waved at Camden, showing I was okay. Then I dove. The support I'd been hiding behind was intact, but had drifted off about 10 feet. I could make it. Diving down, the water was surprisingly clear. I could almost see all the way to the bottom. There was more debris than I anticipated, things blown out from the beach and claimed by the lake. A ruined rowboat, an old tarp, the remains of a parasail. The screaming was just a faint murmur. I saw their feet kicking wildly. Looking over at Carrie, her feet had stopped kicking, and the water was turning red. The screams got louder, but not from her. I came up behind the white air tank I'd been clinging to. Tammy wasn't even making sense at this point. It was just animalistic screeching. Camden looked like a fish out of water, his mouth wide open. The floating dock was broken in two, but the pieces were still held up by the remaining supports. It was a little easier to hide behind, but it was just a matter of time before this whole thing would sink. I dove down again. At first, it was just to get away from a potential shot, but I had an idea. I swam down and grabbed the tarp and the old parasail. It was just a couple of aluminum poles at this point. Coming back up, I held the tarp over myself like a makeshift tent, using one of the poles at an angle. I figured it might obscure me just enough for him to miss a shot or two. It smelled like old dirt and algae, but I was too panicked to care. "He's gonna run out of bolts," Camden yelled. "We gotta bait them out." There was something to it. The bolts were large, and even with the large jacket, there couldn't be that many left. Tammy watched him closely, and as soon as he finished reloading, she called out, "Now!" Then we all dove, trying to move around. I ducked my head under the surface as I heard the approaching noise. Another bolt gone, disappeared into the lake. I came back up, hiding under that tarp. I tried to take long breaths, but it was difficult. Not knowing when the next bolt would fire meant it could come just as I exhaled. As Tammy called out another, "Now!" I dove down like a bullet. I looked back at the others. No more blood in the water. All feet were still kicking. We managed to bait another couple bolts. Then it was a long pause. No one was calling out anything. I looked out from under the tarp. Camden and Tammy were looking out from the side of the wrecked dock. The man in the gas mask was just standing there at the shore, looking at us. He seemed to have one more bolt at the ready, but was reluctant to fire. Maybe he wanted to align that perfect shot. "He's waiting for us to get out," Camden said. "He can't keep guessing. He needs a clear shot." Tammy just stared at him. She couldn't look away. Camden was talking to her, but his words just passed right through. "He can't stay here forever," Camden continued. "We wait, and then we split up." Tammy nodded, keeping her eyes on him still. We must have stayed in the water for well over an hour, clinging on to the remains of the dock. The sun was quickly setting, quickly making the water inhospitable. We were shivering and our lips turned blue. There was a very real chance we'd get hypothermia. My hands were cramped into claws from holding onto the air tank too hard. I could barely feel my feet. He wasn't leaving. He was standing in that exact same spot, waiting to load his crossbow. The bolt dangled from his hand. Camden's jaw was chattering. He was worse off than me and Tammy. I was getting worried he might lose conscious if we didn't act soon. It was getting darker, so it would be harder to hit us. It was now or never. We had to try. We decided to go on the count of 3. Tammy counted us down. 3, 2, 1. We all got out of cover. Tammy called out, "Now!" and I dove. The final bolt sailed right past us. We were in the clear. I popped my head out to see the others heading straight for the shore. The man was just standing there, trying to figure out his next move. We were halfway to the shore when I saw him put his hand down his other jacket pocket. He pulled out another bolt. It was a trick. He'd faked running out. Camden called on us to scatter. Tammy told us to keep going for the shore. I begged them to get to cover. Our voices intermingled into a yelling mess. As I saw him step down on the crossbow and load another bolt, he took aim at us. "Now!" Tammy called out. "Fucking now!" We all dove, but we were out of breath. A couple of seconds passed, and as I broke through the surface, I heard that familiar thumping, except now, it connected to something with a sickening crunch. I hid behind one of the air tanks, and I could see someone else do the same thing in the distance. I couldn't see who it was. The lake got eerily quiet, leaving only the echo of birdsong. I was colder than I thought. I hadn't noticed my teeth chattering. I clung to the side of the air tank, letting my legs rest. I had to break the silence. "Camden?" I called out. "Yeah," he responded. His voice was weak. His throat was raw. It barely sounded like him anymore. I could almost hear his breathing, even from a distance. "Tammy?" he called out. "Tammy, are you?" There was no response, only birdsong. Another click, as a bolt was loaded. I could barely see the man on the shore, but the silhouette was clear. The crossbow was raised and ready. He was listening, aiming. He might have had more bolts than we'd anticipated, but he was making them count. I slowly paddled back towards the tarp I'd dragged up, wrapping it over the air tank. In the dark, and from a distance, it sort of looked like a person. "I'm headed to the shore," Camden called out. "See you there." "Hold on," I called back. "Wait a minute." "I can't, man," he sighed. "I can't. I gotta. Hold on," I repeated. "Don't fuck this up." There was no response. I just heard the pitter-patter of someone paddling back to the shore. I got out of cover, beelining towards Camden. Another thunk as a bolt released. It smacked into the air tank I'd covered with the tarp, punching a hole straight through. Camden called out my name, but I didn't respond. I figured if the attacker thought he'd gotten me, maybe he would stop firing. Then again, maybe he'd go for Camden instead. I had to keep a low profile. Something brushed against my leg. I was in the middle of the debris from the floating dock. There was a piece of garden hose that Harris had used for repairs. I carefully brought it up, blowing out the water inside. I could use it as a makeshift snorkel. I swam towards the shore at an angle, as slowly as I could. As I got closer, I dove down. Fumbling with my stiff hands, I found a large rock. I held it close as an anchor to weigh me down. I held the hose up over the surface. I could breathe through it, but it was a bitter taste, leaving a layer of bacteria on my tongue. The waves would sometimes go a little higher than anticipated, forcing a gulp of water going down my gullet. It was probably the longest couple minutes of my life. I was shivering with every step, clinging to a slippery stone at the bottom of the lake. Shallow breaths interrupted by little drops tickling my throat, but I had to keep going. The water was getting too cold. Soon enough, my head was just below the surface. I had to be really close to the shore. I got down on my knees, crawling the last few feet. As my head breached the surface, I saw that I was off to the side, away from the beach. There were little rocks covering the ground, cutting the soles of my feet as I struggled to stay quiet. The evening air was chilling. I made my way through the underbrush, stepping on roots and fallen branches along the way. I couldn't feel my fingers, and my teeth wouldn't stop chattering. I stepped over a fallen chain-link fence, noticing a half-rusted old metal sign. A few letters had faded, but the message was clear. Private property. Violators will be shot. There was even a little smiley in the corner. I saw the beach from the tree line. Camden had made it ashore, but he was barely holding on. He was laying in the sand, doing his best just to breathe. The man with the gas mask was approaching him with another loaded crossbow, but he wasn't shooting. Not yet. If he wanted Camden dead, he'd be dead already. Instead, he just approached. He poked at Camden with the tip of his boot, but nothing happened. No reaction. I think Camden had lost consciousness by then. Maybe losing everyone was too much for him to bear. No matter the cause, Camden had completely given up. The crossbow man seemingly decided against wasting another bolt on him. Instead, he calmly raised the no diving sign that Tammy had posed with earlier, unloaded his crossbow, and wandered off like nothing happened. As soon as the coast was clear, I ran like a man possessed. By the time I made it to Camden, he was barely breathing. I looked around the beach, couldn't see my things in the dark. I tapped Camden on the cheek, trying to get him to focus, but his eyes were rolled back. There was a noise. It came from Camden's clothes, just a little further down by the water. His phone. It was his worried parents, calling for the third time today. It was easy to forget how often Camden talked to them. I must have sounded absolutely unhinged when I answered, begging them to call for help. Not long after that, I had the emergency services on the line. I had to perform CPR to keep Camden breathing. By the time the EMTs got there, he'd lost a lot of color. We were both severely hypothermic. Those few final minutes at Lake Attabat was nothing short of psychedelic. Colored lights from 4 different vehicles mixing in the dark, highlighting angry and stressed faces. The occasional flash of a camera photography. A body washed up on the beach. A paramedic trying to get me to focus on a little light that he held in front of my eyes. I heard him talk, but it was too distant, like he wasn't really there. For a moment, I thought I might have hallucinated this whole thing. Maybe I was still out on the lake. Maybe this was me watching my life pass before my eyes. I could hear that thumping noise as the metal bolt skipped across the surface in my mind. I could hear it so loudly and clearly that it might have as well been real. A problem that persists to this day. And as we left Lake Attabat, I could imagine the glare of 2 slides of glass from a gas mask in the distance. Watching, waiting. The police came to talk to me at the hospital. They were asking us about trespassing and what had happened. They didn't seem to believe me when I told them about the crossbow man. Autopsies revealed that Pam, Carrie, Harris, and Tammy All had alcohol in their bodies, which was enough to blame it all on some kind of accident. The police had a smashed floating dock, plenty of alcohol, and 4 dead bodies. They connected their own lines. Puncture wounds and witness statements be damned. There were no charges, no investigation, no outcry. Harris and Tammy's parents lost 2 children that day. Camden and I have since tried talking to them, but there has just been no reasoning with them. I don't blame them. They're completely broken. Camden and I have went back there a couple of times, putting up signs of our own, warning passersby of a murderer. I was back there last year, and someone had taken the sign down. The no diving sign was as visible as ever though. That last summer at Lake Attabat was the worst thing I've ever experienced. Just seeing a body of water can make my teeth chatter nowadays. It's like my blood remembers before my mind does. I'm thankful that I can still talk to Camden about it. I think he's taken it worse than me. He's much quieter nowadays, and he rarely goes outside. We're the only ones who really know, and the only ones who truly believe. We've tried to tell others, but they think we're making this up. It sounds much better to have a cross-wielding lunatic than people drowning from alcohol poisoning and a failing floating dock. And people believe what they want. There are accidents all the time. People go missing all the time. But sometimes, the answer is right there, and no one is asking questions about it.